Hola, muy buenas tardes. So today we're going to continue working on the mix between imperfect and pretérito. So as we already know, imperfecto describes a repetitive action. Also, it's a description itself, but also talks about a simultaneous action that happens in the past, right? And pretérito describes an action that has already finished in the past, right? So remember that imperfecto is more an open-ended action in the past. Pretérito also describes two or more consecutive actions which are not the same that simultaneous actions, right? So simultaneous actions are two actions that happens at the same time, while acciones consecutivas, consecutive actions is one before the other one, right? And the most common way on how to use pretérito and imperfecto is when one action interrupts another one. So for example, here, there's a very good example. So the first verb, it's imperfecto because that action has not been finished in the past, but then we have another action that interrupts the main one. So cuando estaba trabajando, so while I was working, mi madre me llamó, my mom called me, right? So that's a very, very typical way of how to use imperfecto and pretérito in one sentence. So let's check these other things that comes with imperfecto and pretérito. So if you go to page 407, you're going to see eventos de estados y eventos puntuales y dinámicos. So learning these, it's very useful because there's some verbs that are part of, there's a spectrum. Let's think imperfecto and pretérito as a spectrum. So here we have imperfecto and here we have pretérito. So there's some verbs that they tend to be more into the imperfect side of the spectrum, and there's other ones that are more into the pretérito part of the spectrum. Why? Because of the nature of the action. So for example, we have some verbs, verbs that are more open-ended. So for example, vivir, right? Estar, ser. Those verbs are very open-ended. They usually takes a long time for being something, to leave something, etc. In the other hand, we have punctual or dynamic verbs, which are verbs that are like that happens from one moment to another one, that are very quickly done. So for example, morir, romper, darse cuenta, right? So darse cuenta, to realize something. With this, I'm not saying that these verbs are always going to be preterite or these other verbs are always going to be imperfect. I'm not saying that, but they will tend to be more preterite and these are going to be more imperfect, right? So it's more common to say when I realized, right? So cuando me di cuenta, so that's a preterite action, instead of saying while I was realizing something, you see? So you can also say the second one as imperfect, but it's more common to say when I realize something because it's more automatic, it's more like instantaneous, right? Another one is chocar, to crash, right? Well, so you can say I crashed somebody else's car, which is more common to say than while I was crashing somebody else's car, right? So you maybe it can be used that as a poetic voice or a narration, like you're like telling a story or you're like writing down a script of some movie, right? But in the daily life, chocar, it's going to be more into the preterite side than imperfect. So knowing and classifying these state verbs and dynamic verbs is going to be very useful for you in when you have to decide. For example, you're in exam 3 and you have a lot of exercise filling out the blanks. right, with the correct verb, and you have to decide if whether it's imperfecto or pretérito. And knowing that this type of verbs exist, subclassification of verb exists, is going to be easier for you to make a better decision. So that's one thing. Then we have also meaning changing verbs. So you go to page 408, I think it's on page 408 or 409, this chart, which is really useful. So here we have some specific verbs that they will change meaning depending if you're saying them in imperfect or preterite. So let's see these ones. Conocer. Conocer, right? That's the infinitive verb. But if we say conocía, right, it would mean I knew that person. But if you say conocí, instead of the translation being to knew somebody, we'll say it would mean met somebody. So knew and met, they're kind of related, but they're not the same meaning, right? So you have to be careful with these. Same thing with querer, poder, and saber. The good things about this is that they're just these couple of verbs. So conocer, querer, poder, y saber, and their negative forms. These are very useful to express correctly what you're trying to say. And here I'm adding an extra one that is not in the book, but I already mentioned that. I already mentioned this in the last class. Verbo ser has also some cultural nuances, right? So verbo ser here, it's when we say cuando él era joven, and we're using era as verbo ser as imperfecto, right? You are saying that, or you're implying that that person might still be alive, right? But if you use fue, so verbo ser in pretérito, that person is probably dead. Okay, so you're implying something, but it's not as explicit as these meaning changing verbs over here. Okay, so yes, you will sometimes you will find out that people will use them interchangeably, and that's confusing even for us Spanish speakers. But this is a more common thing to use, right? So era as something that will be still alive, or fue. And then you will have to make some decisions. We are going to do, hopefully today, a worksheet that's called Superhombre, and there, depending on how you understand Superman, right? If Superman is still alive or is not alive, you are going to decide if he fue or if he era, right? But we're going to see that all together, so no worries about that. So what you're going to do now, so you are going to already watch this video, and we're going to answer all your questions together. And after that, we are going to do all these actividades, guys. Okay, so I know this is a lot, but believe me, you need to do all this because you need to practice pretérito and imperfecto all together. All right, so actividad 8:17, 8:19, 8:22, 8:26, and 8:28. 8:28, it's really important, okay, because this is how it's going to look like the activity, well, not the activity, the part of preterite and imperfect in exam number 3. Same as pasos, actividad 8:17, pasos 1 y 2. Okay, so I'm just going to mark them down with asterisks. Very good. See you in a bit, guys.